Warning: this video contains sensitive topics and is intended for educational purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised. An elderly husband and wife are stabbed a combined 128 times in their own bed. Nothing is stolen. No forensic evidence is left behind. No prints, no DNA, no witnesses. In a quiet college town that has never seen anything like it, the case comes dangerously close to going cold within days. Then, police find their killer, and the town cannot make sense of what they are looking at. He is not a stranger passing through. He is not someone with an obvious history of violence that neighbors had quietly feared for years. He is a 15-year-old honor roll student who 4 years earlier had been celebrated on local news as a hero for saving his own father's life. Before this video is over, you will hear that same boy describe on video exactly what committing those murders felt like, in his own words, while investigators sat across the table from him. This case involves graphic violence against real victims. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. What follows is not a story that resolves cleanly the moment a jury reaches a verdict. It keeps reopening for a decade afterward through appeals hearings and new state laws, and every single time it reopens, the same two families are forced to relive it in a courtroom all over again. Oliver Northup goes by Chip. He is 87 years old, retired, and married to 76-year-old Claudia Maupin. The couple lives in a quiet condominium in Davis, California, a small university town roughly 15 miles from Sacramento, better known for its bicycle paths and almond orchards than for violent crime. Chip and Claudia are not public figures and not wealthy. Neighbors and family would later describe them simply as gentle people living an ordinary retirement together. Their world is small, dinners at home, evenings that end early, a life built around each other. None of that ordinariness offers them any protection from what is coming. A few miles away in that same town lives a very different kind of teenager. Daniel Marsh is 15 years old in the spring of 2013, and on paper looks like nothing out of the ordinary, a Davis kid like any other. But Daniel's history in this town is stranger than most. Back in 2009, when he was around 11 years old, local media actually held him up publicly as a hero after he was credited with helping save his own father's life. His father, Bill Marsh, would later recall that moment with a kind of disbelief. Given everything that followed, the family had genuinely believed Daniel might grow up to be a doctor. He was, in his father's words, all over the media as a young American hero. Something changes in Daniel starting around age 10. Court testimony and family accounts later point to a difficult home environment. As one contributing factor, his parents go through an ugly divorce. His mother becomes seriously ill, and Daniel takes on a caregiving role in the household far beyond anything a boy his age should have to carry. He would later describe feeling emotionally neglected during this period, largely disconnected from both parents, despite living with them. Around this same window of time, the warning signs start, though almost nobody outside the household is positioned to see them clearly. Mental health professionals evaluate Daniel more than once in the years leading up to 2013 and prescribe him antidepressants. But those same evaluators later acknowledge in court that they relied heavily on Daniel's mother to report back basic facts. Whether he was actually taking his medication, whether his behavior at home matched what he presented in session. One of the clearest behavioral red flags on record from this period, according to later court testimony, is Daniel killing a raccoon and several other animals. A detail that surfaces publicly only after the murders when investigators and commentators go looking for anything that might explain what happened. So by April of 2013, two very different versions of the same 15-year-old exist. One is the version Davis remembers from 2009, a local honor roll student once celebrated as a hero. The other is a version almost nobody around him has fully seen yet. Someone who, by his own later account, has been carrying homicidal thoughts for years, quietly building towards something the adults around him did not catch in time. Chip and Claudia, meanwhile, have no idea any of this exists just a few miles from their home. Their daughters would later describe them at trial and in press interviews as two people who had found real happiness together later in life. a second chapter for both of them, built on quiet routines and each other's company. Nothing about their day-to-day life gave any indication that danger was building somewhere else in the same small town they had chosen to grow old in. On the night of April 13th, 2013, prosecutors say Daniel reaches a turning point. According to his own later account, he simply decides he has waited long enough. The fantasies he has been carrying for years are no longer going to stay fantasies. In the early hours of April 14th, Daniel leaves his mother's home. He is dressed head to toe in black. He wears a mask and what investigators later describe as a black pilot's jacket. In his possession is a knife he had sharpened beforehand and taken from his mother's bedroom. This is not a spontaneous decision made in the heat of a single moment. Every piece of it has been prepared in advance. What happens over the next stretch of hours is methodical in a way that unsettles investigators from the moment they learn the details. Daniel walks the streets of Davis testing between 40 and 50 separate homes, looking specifically for an unlocked door or an open window. Anything that would let him inside without forcing his way in and leaving evidence of a break-in. He later tells investigators he was honestly surprised at how well most of Davis secured their homes that night. House after house, he finds locked doors and closed windows and simply moves on to the next address. Eventually, Daniel reaches the condominium, where Chip Northup and Claudia Maupin are asleep. This is the one address out of 40 or 50 where he finally finds what he has been looking for, an open window. Nothing about Chip and Claudia has drawn him to this specific home. They are not targeted because of who they are. They are targeted because on this particular night, out of every house, Daniel tested theirs is the one that is vulnerable. It is worth pausing here on just how much planning investigators later established took place before Daniel ever reached that window. He did not grab the nearest kitchen knife on impulse. He selected and sharpened a weapon in advance. He did not wear his regular clothes. He dressed specifically to avoid being identified and to avoid leaving fiber or hair evidence behind. He did not pick the first house he saw. He tested dozens of addresses methodically until he found one that gave him the access he wanted. Later in court, the trial judge would describe this level of preparation as sophisticated, even by the standards of a hardened adult criminal, not a 15-year-old acting on impulse. This is also the point in the case where the gap between the two versions of Daniel becomes impossible to ignore. The same boy Davis had celebrated as a hero in 2009 is now standing outside a stranger's window at night, having spent hours testing lock after lock with a sharpened knife in his pocket. Nothing about his appearance that night, the mask, the jacket, the careful movement from house to house, would have told anyone watching that this was a kid with an honor roll transcript and a hero story in the local paper just 4 years earlier. By the time Daniel reaches the one open window in that stretch of Davis, the timeline of planning is essentially complete. What happens next takes only minutes. What led up to it took years. Later in the legal process, this same planning becomes a central battleground. Prosecutors seek and win a torture special circumstance allegation against Daniel, a charge his defense specifically fights to have dropped before trial, arguing it did not fit the facts of the case. The motion to dismiss it is denied, and the case proceeds to a preliminary hearing where a Yolo County judge determines there is enough evidence for Daniel to formally answer for both murders as an adult. Because of how much local media attention the case had already drawn by the time of trial, the courtroom is packed for nearly every hearing that follows, a level of public scrutiny almost unheard of for a defendant this young. Daniel cuts a hole into the window screen and lets himself into the home. He makes his way to the bedroom where Chip and Claudia are asleep, and according to his own later confession, simply stands there and watches them for several minutes before he makes his next move. What happens after that is documented both in trial testimony and in Daniel's own recorded confession video played for the jury. He stabs both victims repeatedly. Court records state Chip Northup is stabbed 61 times and Claudia Maupin 67 times. a combined toll of 128 wounds that Claudia's granddaughter would later ask a room full of reporters to sit with for a moment. Testimony presented at trial states that Claudia begged him to stop as she was dying. Prosecutors say Daniel does not stop at the killing itself. According to testimony, he mutilates both bodies after they are already dead. A responding paramedic later testifies that organs had been removed from the scene entirely. None of this is described by prosecutors as the actions of someone who panicked or lost control in the moment. The same controlled precision that got him through the window in the first place appears to carry through everything that happens inside that bedroom. When Daniel leaves, he takes almost nothing physical with him in the way of evidence. No fingerprints are recovered. No footprints are usable. No DNA connects him to the scene. For a 15-year-old with no criminal record and no known connection to either victim, it is by nearly every conventional measure a controlled crime scene rather than a chaotic one, which is exactly what will make this case so difficult to solve in the days that follow. Chip and Claudia are found in their home, a married couple who did nothing more than fall asleep in their own bed the night before. What investigators walk into is a scene later described in a local Davis Enterprise column using the phrase exceptional depravity, two words that would follow this case through years of trial coverage. In the hours after Chip and Claudia are found, investigators are left with almost nothing conventional to build a case on. There is no forced entry in the way that term is normally used, a cut window screen rather than a broken door. There is no obvious motive since nothing in the home appears to have been taken and robbery is ruled out almost immediately. There is no physical evidence connecting any known individual to the scene. Davis is a small university town where a crime of this severity against two elderly retirees with no known enemies is almost unthinkable to the community around them. This is not a city used to headlines about double homicides. For a period of time following the murders, the case genuinely has no identified suspect at all. Whoever committed this crime has planned carefully enough that investigators are left chasing a scene with almost no forensic trail to follow. Word spreads through Davis quickly. A quiet college town suddenly has to reckon with the idea that whoever did this to Chip and Claudia is still out there, and that if the motive is not robbery and not a personal grudge, then there may be no way to predict who else could be at risk. Doors that had never been locked start getting locked. For investigators, every day that passes without a name attached to the case is a day where the trail has more time to go cold. What nobody in Davis knows yet, what investigators themselves do not yet know, is that the person responsible for this has not left town and has not gone quiet out of caution. He has gone back to his normal life, going to school and interacting with friends, as though nothing happened. And it is that same ordinary teenage impulse to talk that is about to become the one mistake careful planning could not account for. For investigators working the case in those early days, the absence of a clear physical trail is compounded by the absence of any obvious connection between a killer and two retirees with no known enemies. There is no history of disputes with neighbors, no financial motive, no domestic angle to chase since the couple's own family is quickly ruled out. Every conventional starting point detectives normally rely on in a homicide investigation comes up empty, one after another, leaving the case sitting almost entirely on whatever comes next from outside the evidence itself. The break in this case does not come from a crime lab. It comes from Daniel himself. Investigators later confirmed that in the days and weeks after the murders, Daniel begins bragging to friends about what he had done. Eventually, one of those friends makes the decision to go to police. That single choice, a teenager deciding he cannot sit on what he has been told, is what finally connects a 15-year-old honor roll student to a double homicide that had otherwise left almost no physical trail. Once Daniel becomes a person of interest, investigators bring him in for questioning and a video confession is eventually recorded. In it, Daniel walks through the crime in detail, cutting the window screen, letting himself in watching the couple sleep, and then attacking them. He describes being surprised at how well most of the homes in Davis were secured that night forcing him through dozens of addresses before he found one that was vulnerable. He also tells investigators something that chills the room even further, that he had already been planning to kill again, describing an idea of wandering the streets of Davis with a bat looking for his next opportunity. The confession alone does not end the legal fight over what happened. Daniel's defense team does not dispute that he committed the murders. Instead, his attorney argues in court that his actions should be understood in the context of his parents' divorce and the antidepressant medication he had been prescribed. A defense strategy aimed less at the facts of the crime and more at explaining why a 15-year-old would be capable of it in the first place. Prosecutors take a very different position, centered on how deliberate the crime was from start to finish. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Deborah Schmidt testifies for the prosecution that the level of planning on display in this case, sharpening a weapon in advance, dressing specifically to avoid detection, and methodically testing dozens of homes for the one vulnerable entry point, is simply inconsistent with a psychotic break or an impulsive teenage act. A psychotic person, she explains, would typically show disorganized thinking under that kind of heightened emotional state, rather than this level of controlled preparation. She describes what Daniel did in blunt clinical terms as predatory aggression. This was done, she tells the court, to satisfy his own thoughts and desires. Dr. Schmidt's evaluation becomes a turning point for the prosecution's case, because it directly undercuts the defense's attempt to frame Daniel's actions as the product of mental illness beyond his control. Separately, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Matthew Solier, who had interviewed Daniel before trial, describes him to a room of true crime professionals years later as cold and callous, recalling one interview in which Daniel grew quiet and distant before. Telling him, "I'm thinking about stabbing you in the neck with a pen and crushing your head with a laptop," forcing Soulier to end the session early. A jury ultimately finds Daniel sane at the time of the crime, which, under California law, makes him eligible for the maximum sentence available to someone his age. But sanity in the legal sense, and the deeper question of what actually drove a once-celebrated local kid to do this, are two very different things. And that gap is exactly where the next part of this story lives. The case draws national attention well beyond Yolo County. CBS News' 48 Hours produces an episode examining how investigators moved from a scene with almost no physical evidence to a fully recorded confession in a matter of weeks, a turnaround that in hindsight comes down almost entirely to Daniel's own decision to tell people what he had done. For a case built on such careful physical planning, it is a strikingly ordinary human failure that finally breaks it open. Not a lab result, but a teenager who could not keep quiet. The detail that reframes this entire case is not a new piece of forensic evidence. It is who Daniel Marsh was before any of this happened. This was not an anonymous drifter passing through Davis, and it was not a kid with a long visible history of red flags the whole town had quietly worried about for years. This was a boy Davis had once put on the local news as a hero. The same boy his own father believed might grow up to become a doctor. At trial, forensic psychologist Matthew Logan testifies that Daniel scored 35.8 out of 40 on the psychopathy checklist, a standardized tool used to assess psychopathic traits in criminal evaluations. Logan tells the court that a person with a profile like Daniel's is virtually impossible to rehabilitate. Testimony that would later draw scrutiny on appeal, partly because Logan had not personally interviewed Daniel, and partly because he acknowledged some of the traits the checklist measures can shift as a juvenile matures. Even so, the number itself, 35.8 out of 40, becomes one of the most repeated details in press coverage of the case in the years that follow. In a recorded statement played for jurors during the confession video, Daniel describes how committing the murders actually felt to him in his own words. "It felt right," he says. "It felt amazing. It felt great." For a courtroom already weighing whether this was predatory aggression rather than a mental break, those three phrases land as confirmation rather than explanation. Years later, in 2018, while pushing to have his case reclassified as a juvenile matter, which would have led to his early release, Daniel delivers a talk from inside prison at a TEDx event. In it, he tells the audience, hurt people, explaining that when he first heard that phrase, it was like the entire world made sense to him. When a clip of that talk is later played publicly in front of Claudia's granddaughter, Sarah Rice, she visibly reacts with revulsion on stage. For the family, that framing lands less like genuine insight and more like an extension of the same detachment that let him commit the murders in the first place. What makes this twist land the way it does is the contrast it forces into view. Somewhere between the 11-year-old local hero story in 2009 and the 15-year-old who tested 40 or 50 homes with a sharpened knife in 2013, something shifted that almost nobody around Daniel caught in time. Even years later from inside a prison cell, he is still describing his own capacity for violence in terms that sound less like remorse and more like clarity. Prosecutors would later point to that same contrast as the reason this case struck such a nerve well beyond Yolo County. Most true crime cases involving teenage killers come with some visible thread the public can point to in hindsight. A documented history of violence, a pattern of abuse, a trail of smaller warning crimes. Daniel's case unsettled people specifically because that thread was so thin. The public hero story and the private psychopathy checklist score both belong to the same 15-year-old at the same time. And almost nobody around him had access to both halves of that picture until it was already too late. In September 2014, a Yolo County jury convicts Daniel Marsh on 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with additional findings of lying in wait torture and multiple murders. He is subsequently found sane, which, under California law, makes him eligible for the maximum sentence available to an offender his age. The court sentences him to 52 years to life. For Chip and Claudia's family, it is the outcome they had hoped for, and for a while, it appears the legal story is finally over. It is not. In 2016, California voters passed Proposition 57, reshaping how the state handles juvenile offenders. 2 years later, in 2018, lawmakers go further with Senate Bill 1391, a law that bars 14 and 15-year-olds from being prosecuted as adults at all, regardless of the crime. Because Daniel was 15 at the time of the murders, this new law opens the door to his entire case being reclassified as a juvenile matter, a legal path that could have led to his release at age 25 instead of the 52-year sentence a jury had already handed down. Yolo County Superior Court Judge Samuel McAdam holds a transfer hearing in October 2018 to decide whether Daniel's case should move to juvenile court. McAdam ultimately rules against Daniel keeping the case in adult court and reinstating his original sentence. In his written ruling, McAdam describes the home invasion and murders as highly sophisticated, even for the most hardened and seasoned adult criminal, and concludes that Daniel has not made any meaningful progress addressing the underlying triggers of his childhood trauma that continue to pose a risk to society. No one is to blame for the crimes, McAdam writes, except Daniel Marsh. Daniel's attorneys continue appealing on the same underlying legal question for years afterwards, centered on whether his original sentence was truly final before Senate Bill 1391 took effect. In 2021, the California 3rd District Court of Appeal rules against him, a panel of judges directly disputing his attorney's argument that the 2018 hearing amounted to a new trial. In 2023, the California Supreme Court declines to review the case entirely, closing that chapter for good. Claudia's daughter, Victoria Hurd, would later describe the moment she learned of that final ruling as a cry of both relief and joy. Relief that the family could finally stop fighting, and joy, as she put it, because Daniel Marsh stays where he belongs, in prison. Daniel Marsh is currently held at R.J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego, serving his 52 years to life sentence. According to the California Department of Corrections, he becomes eligible for parole in December 2036, when he will be in his late 30s. Throughout the appeals process, Victoria Heard and Claudia's granddaughter Sarah Rice have continued speaking publicly against any path to his early release, calling him a diagnosed psychopath, and stating plainly that they do not believe he has changed. Sarah Rice has said she hates to think he still has the capacity to do this again, but that he has already told people himself that he would. Chip Northup and Claudia Maupin did nothing more than fall asleep in their own bed on an ordinary night in April 2013. The boy who once appeared in Davis local news as a young hero is the same person a jury and 3 separate courts have since agreed was responsible for what happened to them next. The town that once celebrated him is still living with what he became. In the years since the final ruling, Chip and Claudia's family has not simply moved on quietly. They founded an advocacy campaign known publicly as Scrap SB 1391, aimed at changing the state law that nearly reopened Daniel's case a decade after his conviction, arguing that no future family should have to fight the same legal battle twice over a sentence that had already been handed down by a jury. For them, the case is no longer only about one killer. It has become about whether the law itself can be trusted to keep its word to victims once a verdict is final. 12 years on from the night Chip and Claudia were killed, the legal fight over Daniel Marsh's sentence has mostly gone quiet, but it is not guaranteed to stay that way. California's approach to juvenile sentencing has already changed twice since 2013, and the family's advocacy work exists specifically because they do not trust that it will not change again before Daniel's earliest possible parole date arrives in 2036.